seminals of
إيقاف التسجيل زر
the Second Seminole War in the mid-1830s. The neat bullet hole provides a lasting reminder of what happened to those who fought to defend their homeland in 19th century Florida. This is just one of 78 illustrations of native North and South American skulls featured in Samuel George Morton's Crania Americana, published in Philadelphia in 1839. It is undoubtedly the most important book in the history of scientific racism. The 19th century was a period in which science was increasingly used to justify racist ideas. In a claim typical of these developing racial sciences, Morton wrote of Native Americans that the structure of his mind appears to be different from that of the white man. The idea that Native Americans could not integrate into modern industrial society was central to both Morton's argument and also President Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act. From the passage of this act in 1830 onwards, Native American people, including the Seminoles featured in Crania Americana, had been forcibly relocated to the west of the Mississippi River. Within a few years, Crania Americana had been read in the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and India. James Cowles Pritchard, the foremost British anthropologist, described it as an exemplary work, whilst Charles Darwin also considered Morton an authority on the subject of race. My research here at the University of Cambridge looks to explain how Crania Americana became so influential, not just in the United States, but in Europe and beyond. How could a book with a print run of just 500 copies make such an impact? This research is crucial for understanding the ways in which racist theories gain credibility. Particularly in Europe, scholars tended to view American science with suspicion. Morton had to work hard to convince his peers across the Atlantic Ocean that Crania Americana should be taken seriously. It was the illustrations which really helped establish Morton's reputation in Europe. To create the eerie, naturalistic look we find in these images, Morton's artists used a new technique called lithography. The artists first drew each image onto a limestone block in wax, before chemically fixing the image, inking, and printing. The limestone allowed the artists to create this textured effect, reproducing the subtle contours of each skull in Morton's collection. This texture also allowed men in Europe, like James Cowles Pritchard, to make the perverse claim that Native American skulls were actually of a different consistency to Europeans. Here we have a set of loose lithographic plates. Morton had these printed in Philadelphia and sent to Britain in order to promote Crania Americana in Europe. These images are unique. I was amazed when I first discovered them, just tucked into the back of the copy of Crania Americana held here at the Whipple Library. Looking at these, we can start to imagine what it was like for 19th century men of science when they first saw Morton's beautiful yet troubling illustrations. Darwin himself first encountered Crania Americana just like this. He was in the audience when James Cowles Pritchard displayed Morton's plates at the 1839 British Association for the Advancement of Science meeting in Birmingham. Crania Americana was expensive. It cost $20 in the United States and over £6 in Britain. That's at least 2 months' wages for the average farm labourer at the time. And as such, it was only the most wealthy institutions which could afford to purchase it. Royal Society held a copy, whereas the London Mechanics' Institute did not. But working class readers were certainly aware of Morton and his skulls. In Britain, phrenologists like George Combe promoted Crania Americana in the cheap periodical press, some of which were available for just a couple of pence. Here we have an example from the Phrenological Journal in Edinburgh. The local Phrenological Society arranged for woodcut copies of Crania Americana plates to be printed into their journal. Particularly in Europe, where copies of the book were even more scarce, a greater number of readers encountered Crania Americana as a cheap review rather than as a complete, expensive folio volume. People often associate Crania Americana with slavery, but skulls from Africa are given relatively little attention in the book. In contrast to the spectacular Native American lithographs, African skulls only appear as small woodcuts. Nonetheless, the spurious claim that African skulls were small certainly went down well with slave owners. But it wasn't until later in the century that supporters of slavery really started to take up Morton's ideas in great numbers. And what's more, in Europe, the majority of readers of Crania Americana were in fact abolitionists fighting slavery. The phrenologist George Combe was an anti-slavery man, as was the anthropologist James Cowles Pritchard. By using Morton's ideas, abolitionists countered the claim that slaves would seek revenge if set free. George Combe described Africans as tameable for this very reason. It was an odd logic. For these men, the idea that Africans had small skulls and weak minds proved that they would not turn violent if set free. In Quentin Tarantino's film Django Unchained, it's the vile southern slave owner, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, who takes up the craniological ideas. But in real life, it was just as likely to be an abolitionist. Anti-slavery and scientific racism were not mutually exclusive in the 19th century. I think this research ultimately shows just how alert we need to be to the variety of places in which racist ideas can take hold. It can seem counterintuitive at first, but in advocating for the abolition of slavery, men like George Combe and James Cowles Pritchard opened up a space in which scientific racism could flourish. The Crania Americana exhibition here at the Whipple Library is a stark reminder of that unsettling history.